6 generations on his mother's side, so the family's been here for a while. Isaiah really doesn't have a clue about knowing me, but I've followed him ever since he was born, just because I know his people. So I've heard reports all through the years of how good and successful he's been, and I know he was always smart as a young man. And I remember when he was at MSU, there was some kind of picture in the paper where he had this business going already, and I think that was maybe 10 or 11 years ago at least, where he'd haul apples down to MSU and sell them to the students, and it was quite the business. And then after he graduated, I don't know, did you major in agriculture? Or
I actually did undergrad at U of M and studied public policy there, and then I did economics at Michigan State for my
So economics, and he worked for the Michigan Economic Development Corporation for a while. If you want to see more of him speechifying, if you go to the Old Michigan Land Use Institute website, it's now Groundworks, but you have to go to the Michigan Land Use Institute one. And he does a really good talk about the PDR program on the peninsula and how it benefited his family, and so I found that pretty interesting. So he's currently working with farm operations here, and I think we should just let him go for it. And his dad is here as backup. Josh wants sitting there. If Isaiah has any questions, so I think you're really going to enjoy this talk.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 4 generations of my family who've lived here. I've never been to one of these talks before, so if I miss anything, I'm going to give you guys plenty of opportunities to ask questions at the end. I'm going to also let my dad talk about my great-grandparents and my grandparents in particular, because he had a much longer-term relationship with my grandparents than I did, and knew my great-grandparents. And I will try not to knock out the PowerPoint again. So my great-grandparents, Edward, or EF, and Marion Wunsch bought their first property in northern Michigan up on Boblo Island in the early 1920s, or late teens, early 20s, I'm not 100% sure. Edward had become interested in real estate law and real estate in northern Michigan when he was studying, he was a law clerk for a major railroad company, so he had looked at the real estate purchases that the railroads were making when they were trying to figure out how to get rail cars up north and conceivably across the straits. I think that's how they wound up with the property on Boblo Island, because they had looked at one point at jumping a series of short bridges across some of the islands in the straits. They had a cottage on Boblo Island for just a few years, and then they started to have children. And my great-grandmother Marion, I think, started to push for a summer place that was a little bit closer to a hospital in case one of her kids fell down or had an accident or got sick. So they abandoned the property up on Boblo Island. I don't know if everybody knows where Boblo Island is, but it's a few miles away from Mackinac Island, up in the Straits on the Lake Huron side. So they abandoned the property up there, purchased the 80-acre original Wunsch farm on the basically on the very north end of Peninsula Drive. There are a couple of properties further down the road from our farm, but we're off of Phelps Road. The farm that they purchased as their second summer place has basically become the hub of our current farming operation. So it's still in the family, and it's still our main base, I guess. So So the four children of Edward and Marion were Edward Jr., Betty, Richard, and Ellis. Ellis was my great-grandfather, and many of you who know
your grandfather.
our grandfather, yeah. Anything else you want to say about Edward and Marion? Okay. So many of you who've known the Wunsch family for a long time probably knew Alice and Anne, who were my grandparents. And they were up here pretty frequently. My dad would know this better than I do, but my grandfather Ellis went to U of M for undergrad. He'd grown up in southeast Michigan. I think shortly after he finished his master's degree, he joined the Navy during World War II, and then by the time my dad was born in 1948, they were living up here full time, and Ellis was involved with getting Northwestern Michigan College started. So during that period, from 1948 to 1953, that was probably his primary occupation.
1948, he was in Dijon on a Fulbright scholarship,
Okay.
participating in the reconstruction of the educational system in Europe.
Okay.
And then he came back. He had purchased the farm on East Carroll Road by that time. So he came back to that location and needed something to do. He was teaching for extension.
Okay. So, as my dad said, they added a couple of other farms with my grandparents when they moved up here. So the farm where my grandparents and their children lived was off of East Carroll Road. So basically up the road from Peninsula Cellars. My dad went to school at the Maple Grove School, which would later become Peninsula Cellars, from kindergarten to third grade. While they were getting NMC started, my grandparents were also involved, as were many of the other families out here, in consolidating the one-room schoolhouses into the single school that is now Old Mission. So I guess a timely thing to be talking about. My grandmother Anne was also very involved with getting the Peninsula Community Library started at the Old Mission School. Anything else that you think I should add about that period in the family history, Ed?
No?
All right. So I'm assuming that I'm glossing over a lot, but let's see. So my grandparents would eventually buy the main farm from E.F. and Marion, but each of the original Wunsch children, Edward, Betty, Richard, and Ellis, wound up with a piece of beach frontage on the original farm, which has been a really interesting thing, well, a really great thing over the years, because it's kept us close to our second and third cousins, even as the family has moved away from this area and away from where they were living in southeast Michigan. So I guess that first Anne and Ellis chapter up here came to a close in 1959, at least on a year-round basis, when they moved back to Ann Arbor, where Ellis went to finish his PhD. He originally went down with a leave of absence from NMC, but wound up getting involved in starting another college at the U of M. So he was a permanent faculty member there once he had finished his PhD until his retirement in the early 80s. But at about the same time that Ellis and Anne moved back down to Ann Arbor, my great uncle Richard, who was a doctor at Munson for quite a while, was moving up to this area with his family. So if any of you know John Wunsch, John is one of Richard's sons, and he's lived out here for quite a while as well. So after completing college, Josh moved back to the main farm and began to farm full-time. Cherry farming at that time was going through a really significant revolution. The farmers were moving from hand-picking all of the cherries to mechanically harvesting them. So the scale that you needed to have a really viable cherry farming operation was increasing, and a lot of newer, more scientific methods of managing crop production were coming out at the same time. So in the business, my dad's first two big accomplishments were adopting the modern harvesting technologies and sort of the modern management techniques. And in the process of making some of those changes, he was able to grow the farm pretty substantially, and has been able to sustain the growth through the present. My dad's siblings, Sarah and Charlie, also lived on the farm intermittently during the 70s. And my cousin John bought the Pratt farm, which is the farm with all of the white buildings with red roofs during the 1980s. So as I had mentioned, Alice and Ann moved back to Ann Arbor, where they pursued careers in higher education until they retired. For a good chunk of that time, my dad was living in the main farmhouse. But by the late 70s or early 80s, my grandparents had decided that they wanted to move back up. And while my dad was working on purchasing his own farm, the house wasn't really in good enough shape to live in yet. So he went to find another place to live down the road. This proved fortuitous for my family, probably for my sister and I in particular, because he wound up renting a place from Freddie Dome, who was my uncle, and my mother, Barb Dome at the time, was moving back into the area at about the same time, so things converged, and my sister and I. So that's, and the Dome family has been out here for a long time. If you guys want to hear about the Dome family, my cousin Melzar is in the audience, so he can do that one for you. Let's see. Both of my parents have always been very involved, both on the peninsula and more broadly. Josh was involved really early on with conservation efforts, both here and at the state level and nationally. Conservation and agriculture have always worked hand in hand. But what was unique up here was the Purchase of Development Rights program. My dad was an early advocate of PDR. He also served for about 30 years 25 years, as a director and vice president of the Michigan Farm Bureau. So he was able to influence state and national policies relating to agriculture from that position. And it's amazing, I worked in state government for about 5 years. And the number of policies that I ran into that I knew my family had some role in forming was pretty amazing. My mom, Barb, has worked off the farm as a registered dietitian for her whole career. She's also a governor with the National Sherry Festival Board, a member of the Peninsula Community Library Board, and owns a community-supported agriculture business. I think something important that I've learned from both my parents and the ancestry on both sides, which I think is a really important facet of the community in Peninsula Township, is that it's really important to be engaged. Growing up, I complained a lot. I was a whiny little kid, so it was important, I think, that my parents drilled into my developing mind that it's one thing to be indignant about problems or to get upset about things, but and that's fine, but you have to be solutions oriented. It's really important to see the issue of the day and work through it in a pragmatic way. And I think that's something that, if you look at all of the families that have been in this area for a long time, it's something that we've been able to do for many, many years, and it's something that we're very good at as a community. I don't know how much you guys want me to talk about the farm, but we're still farming cherries and apples 95 years later. The circle picture up at the top is my dad with my sister in a new high-density Honeycrisp block. So even though we're growing the same crops that we've always been growing, things are continuing to change and modernize. And my younger sister Belle has been really instrumental with helping to lead some of the changes with new orchard technologies, looking at new fruit varieties, and just helping us keep pace with our rapidly evolving industry. As time has gone on, we've really moved toward fresh cherries and fresh apples. So as Anne was saying, I was involved 11 years ago with marketing some of our first Honeycrisps down in Ann Arbor, and I think that's the direction that we're looking at moving in now. Is, I think, interesting historical perspective, I guess, that during my dad's formative years on the farm, we were moving toward mechanical harvesting, and that for our farm, one of the biggest challenges right now is figuring out how to get back to hand labor, because a lot of the fresh fruit is extremely labor intensive. So it's just funny that you reposition to a new crop and you're kind of going back into an old direction. And I think that's pretty much the end of my presentation. Do you guys have any questions for me? Or questions for my dad? I mean, he's really the wealth of knowledge on all of this.
Isaiah, what are you guys, just dumb question, does the smaller concentrated technologies apply to cherries too? Along with apples? Is that common?
Yeah, we're still evaluating the high density cherry blocks, but that's an experiment that Adele is working on. So we haven't planted any at a commercial scale yet, but we're looking at them.
What kind of productivity numbers are you getting under apples? You're getting much higher density, much more per acre.
It increases the productivity.
Possibility, right?
Yeah, it increases the productivity per acre by about 50% under the most optimistic scenario.
The problem is they don't have the machines to pick the small.
Yeah, well, any piece of fruit that you buy fresh to eat without preparation in a grocery store is hand-picked for the most part. So most of the cherries that we grow in northern Michigan are for processing markets. So the other thing that we grow a lot of are dark sweet cherries for the yogurt market. So they're taken right from our farm to a processing plant down in Oceana County, where they're pitted and frozen. So the quality isn't quite as important. So the cherry shakers really improve your efficiency if you're growing for the processing market, but they do enough damage to the fruit so that you can't market them for fresh.
Yeah, they're used for institutional.
Yep.
Could you talk about your experience at the Old Mission School?
Sure. Well, I think it was really, I mean, this is a personal experience, I guess, but it was really